Get concentrated so that you don't fuck up the work.
You like to get concentrated.
Don't let the splash blind you.
Get over here.
I need you. I put a blanch.
Okay, ready?
We ready?
I'll start.
Thank you, Dean.
We'll play a little intro and then smell it. Well,
Dean's
all
intro.
right here.
Shut up. Got it.
Fast mover start.
All right, here we go.
take I one. think the flash is ready. You turn up the flag.
Four blue 832s, all to all with CVUs, 6,000 mini rounds, drives Charlie underground. We got 12 gross of 20 Mike. That's enough for any strike. We fly war machines by all means, spreads with a load. 4 hours station time, any less would be a crime. Fantastic BDA, 'cause we drop on a dime. Tail dragging is the way, a swoop beats a blowjob any day. We fly war machines by all means, spreads with a load. We know every copy and every trail, all of their bullshit and all of their tales. Every ballpark and every team leader by the sound of a scream. We make 20 passes on the deck. Take some hits, but what the heck? We fly war machines by all means, spreads with a load. Fast movers in the night means search and rescue at first light. Hey beeper, come up voice, get your young ass on that horse. We took big air bursts on this SAR. This could be my silver star. We bring Charlie Grease by all means, stands with a load. I see an F4 taking off and I start to think, why don't they move it? Why don't they jinx? Seems like every star I've been on since I've been down, it was for some fast mover who was fucking around. But it's our day and we don't care. Like the dust and we'll be there. We fly war machines by all means, spreads with a load, spreads with a load.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me this week on my latest model review video. Today we have the A-1 Skyraider again. This one is an A-1J in U.S. Air Force colors. This one is in the livery of the 602nd Special Operations Squadron, operating out of Nakhon, Phenom, Thailand, circa 1969. Obviously, the name of this one, as you can see on the cowling, is Sock It to 'em. So that's exactly what these airplanes basically did when they were in the Southeast Asian theater. But let's start at the beginning, because I think it's worth sharing the story of how the Skyraider actually wound up in Vietnam to start with. How is it that this propeller-engined relative anachronism wound up doing close air support and special operations coverage plus search and rescue in 1965? I mean, you think about it, this is a propeller engine attack airplane in a day and age where you've got Mach 2 interceptors. So what's the story? How did this airplane get there? And that's a good place to start the story, because essentially how it happened is in 1954, a series of agreements were signed in Geneva to settle the issue of who exactly would be running the country of Vietnam. The only thing that all the sides of the agreement could agree on is that the French had no business running the place any longer than they did. So one of the agreements of the Geneva discussions in 1954 was that the French would withdraw from what would later be called North Vietnam. Once the French withdrew their troops, 2 years into the future from signing that agreement, there would be elections across the entirety of the Vietnamese peninsula. And once the elections were counted out, whoever won the election would run the entire country, North and South combined. So, due to the fact that the South Vietnamese government, though Western aligned, was hopelessly corrupt, it was not a very popular government, and it was pretty well understood by the powers that were in Washington, D.C., that if there was an election that was held in 1956, North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh would win by a landslide against the hopelessly corrupt regime of the South Vietnamese president Diem. So, to avoid losing the South Vietnamese government and therefore taking a wallop in the reputational press, because once again, the Vietnam country would then fall into communism, and then you'd have a repeat of the whole McCarthyist, we've lost another country to the Reds deal, and then you have the whole Western obsession, or I should say the American obsession with the domino theory. And China, remember, had just converted to the communist cause under Mao Zedong. So there was a lot of popular paranoia in Washington, D.C. at this time that if another country in Indochina fell to the communist bloc, there would be chaos and not necessarily good news in terms of advancement of the free world against the Soviet bloc. So this perception, along with just pragmatic imperialist policy, led to the U.S. making behind-the-scenes move to scuttle the 1956 elections, leading to what we would later see happen with the North and South Vietnamese wars. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Coming back to the subject of the Geneva Agreements in 1954, part of the stipulations of these documents were that no foreign country, I should say, would be allowed to introduce what would be termed advanced weaponry into the theater. So the Soviet Union would not be allowed to sell quote-unquote advanced weaponry to the North Vietnamese, and in turn, no foreign country, U.S. or otherwise, could sell advanced weaponry to the South Vietnamese government. So ostensibly this was done to reduce military activity, and in that respect, the agreements were a colossal, gigantic sociological failure. So along those lines, because of the nature of that Geneva Agreement, the U.S. government did not station advanced airplanes initially into Vietnam. What they did instead was they stationed high-speed reconnaissance aircraft, which, being unarmed, were in compliance with the Accords, and they stationed the A-1 Skyraider. Because the A-1 is, of course, a propeller-engined airplane that had already been in service over 20 years at that point, anybody who filed a legislative grievance against using these attack airplanes would have to face the fact that they definitely met the definition of obsolete equipment, especially compared to the fact that, F-4s and MiG-21s are zipping around at Mach 2 all day. So because of that dynamic, the Skyraiders gained a renewed lease on life, and in conjunction with the U.S. Navy phasing theirs out, the U.S. Air Force would buy the Navy stock, refurbish them, and then station them in South Vietnam. Initially, the A-1E, which is a two-seat version, so far as I know that has not been modeled in a die-cast format as of yet, was stationed under the 602nd in 1964. So the 602nd was stood up and arranged to operate out of Bien Hoa Air Base, South Vietnam in 1964, and their stated missions were close air support and combat search and rescue, which is of course where the Sandy call sign comes from, although it should be noted that that was not the only operating call sign that the search and rescue squads used. So what's search and rescue? Well, search and rescue essentially is the search and rescue of downed aircrew. So as would happen in combat operations, occasionally you have one or two airplanes get shot down. And the purpose of search and rescue is to retrieve the aircrew of whoever so happens to be unfortunate enough to have their flight end in gunfire. And in this role, the A1s, like the one you see here, were very well suited. They flew slow, and you have to remember 1960s here, so lantern targeting pods and GPS-based weaponry weren't really a thing yet. So to precisely identify friend and foe, you had to use a Mark I eyeball and binoculars, which meant flying very, very slow. The top speed of these airplanes is about 200 knots in a dive. Usually they flew between 170 and 190 on cruise, so that's a nice slow speed to be able to look down and see where the friendlies are and where the enemy are, which then of course allows more precise placement of ordnance. Incidentally, this is something that many people who are fans of the A-10 propose as a plus for that airplane to this day, because it's so slow that you can just look out the window and see where the bad guys and good guys are without having to orient a targeting pod and worry about electronic interference or cloud cover, et cetera, et cetera. But returning to the A1, the A1s initially operated out of South Vietnam until 1968, when, in a fit of military reorganization, they were relocated to Nakhon, Phenom, Thailand. That wasn't the only operating base that the A1s flew out of, but that was one of the largest. And the 602nd decamped from Bien Hoa to Nakhon, Phenom in 1968. For those of you that are more studious fans of Vietnamese history and the Southeast Asian War, it should be noted that Nakhon Phenom was very rarely called that by the U.S. Air Force crews. They usually referred to it as Naked Fanny. And I say that because, well, if you hear people in various documentaries refer to Naked Fanny, understand that they are referring to Nakhon Phenom Air Base in Thailand. Further, I believe there is an A1 out there on the airshow circuit that is named Naked Fanny. And that is the reason why that airplane has that name, because it's a hat tip to the units that operated out of Nakhon Phanom, Thailand. So the 602nd operated out of Nakhon Phanom, once again running close air support missions, both in support of U.S. and South Vietnamese, as well as on the clandestine level, the Hmong General Vang POW forces of Laos. So that element, of course, is more of a part of the special operations aspect of their mission. And they also did search and rescue, which was a very, very messy business. Hundreds of Skyraiders were eventually lost in this war because of that. When you're flying at low level and dealing with 12.7 millimeter machine guns, you're going to get hit and you're going to lose airplanes. And unfortunately, that happened quite a bit with these aircraft. They flew in that service until 1972, when the A-1s were withdrawn from the theater along with a lot of other U.S. military forces as part of a general drawdown from the Southeast Asian conflict at that time. So these airplanes had quite a storied history, and I do recommend that anyone interested in learning more, please read the stories from the Osprey books on the A-1 Skyraider in Southeast Asia, as well as Korea. So if I ever get my hands on a Korean Skyraider, I'll probably do a video on that as well. But as it is, I've already spent way too much time or prattling on about these things. I will make a note, too, that I did just watch Devotion? Yes, I almost said Devoted there. I did watch Devotion this weekend, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that the A-1 does have a starring role in that movie, which it should, because it did quite a bit of strategic interdiction, bombing, and close support in the Korean War, which is something that tends to get overlooked sometimes when talking about the Skyraider's notable history. So, indeed, the Skyraider has got a long legacy behind it, and again, if you're a fan of aviation, I'll just take an aside here and make a plug for watching Devotion. Go see it in as big a screen as you can practically watch it, because much like Top Gun 2, it is best experienced in as wide screen and as loud of a format as you can. It is really well done, and the story is not too heavy on, shall we say, political slant. There's no bias really to that. It's just a pretty clean story that's being told, and a good character drama. So, and there's a side of really cool aviation footage. So if you're a fan of the Corsair, you definitely need to watch it. And if you're a fan of the Skyraider, I highly recommend it. So with that, we'll move on to talking about the model itself. So I will say that I did buy this one secondhand from a forum member, so it is not 100% what you would see out of the box if you ordered this from HobbyMaster. The pilot figure, for one thing, is much better. I believe the previous owner put their own pilot figure in, which is understandable because A, the HobbyMaster ones are kind of generic, and B, the HobbyMaster pilot model, as I mentioned in my last Skyraider video, tends to sit pretty low. The Skyraider cockpit, usually the pilots would sit generally right about here. In general seat elevation to get a good look out of that canopy, but the HobbyMaster pilot sits like at eye level with the canopy sill, like somewhere over there, which is not realistic nor particularly attractive or accurate. So on the US Navy one, I just put a little bit of blue tack under the included pilot seat to get the elevation a little better. But the previous owner of this one put an actual, like, much better aftermarket pilot figure in here, and I think it's a great addition to this model. So do bear that in mind if you do get this from HobbyMaster. The standard quote-unquote pilot figure is probably going to sit a little low relative to what it really was. I did also modify this one, so the weathering that you see on the external fuel tank right here, as well as the exhaust from the big 18-cylinder right engine, that's something that I've also applied. I've also applied some silver flake to the edges of the wing, which you might kind of catch here and here, and on some of the cowling elements as well as on the other side in the earlier shots. I've done that intentionally because when Socket to 'em was in theater, these aircraft accumulated quite a bit of wear and tear. And one of the things that happens to the leading edges of airplanes is the paint gets worn off or chipped off just because of debris, and you see the bare metal underneath. So I thought it wise to apply a little bit of titanium flake to the edge of the wings, just kind of as a way of getting that effect to the model. So I've also applied some weathering, of course, to the bottom here, reflecting the fact that she has a really big 18-cylinder freaking engine, and it churns out quite a bit of exhaust, so she's going to look dirty. Just bear in mind that when you get this out of the box, it's going to be 100% clean. There won't be any markings on it, which, again, like I said, in my last Skyraider video, that's going to be something that you as a collector will have to either be happy with or make arrangements to dirty it up yourself. I used Tamiya black polish, or I should say black panel wash, to get these effects, and a Q-tip. I also used some black paint on the areas closest to the exhaust, since that's generally where the greatest amount of oil is going to be accumulating. So the rest, of course, I used the Tamiya to get this effect here, illustrating how the exhaust flows down the side of the fuselage. So bear in mind, if you ever see one of these in person, which I hope to someday, and you do want to climb on the wing, it's going to be covered in oil because that is a very big engine. So watch your grip when you're doing that. Again, should you ever have the fortune of seeing one of these in person, they let you get a look at the cockpit. So the model, I also added the sensor probe up here. This broke off, I think maybe 10 seconds after I pulled it out of the box. The sensor probe up there is unfortunately rather easy to damage when you get it out of the box. I very nearly did that on my US Navy one, but thankfully it's still attached. Just bear in mind that when you're handling the model, that's very easy to break. So I put some, I think it's a 3/32, some really thin gauge solder, and just glued it back up there. And yeah, unless I mentioned it, you probably wouldn't know the difference. So also bear in mind if you get one of these, that the 20mm cannons right here can get a bit, they're very easy to bend. They stick out pretty far from the wing, just like on the actual airplane, and they are unfortunately very easy to bend if you handle this airplane moderately and correctly. So just bear that in mind. And some of the other details here, like the prop information that you see on the inside, as well as the tips being yellow, really well done. I do like that detail. The socket to them on the cowling is good. The colors are pretty, from what I can tell, fairly accurate. It's hard to really get a good gauge of that because, of course, wartime airplanes tend to have a certain amount of unique wear and tear to the finish. So depending on when the shot's taken, whether the airplane has just arrived in theater or if it's been there 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, all of those dynamics can affect what the color scheme looks like. So when comparing it to the shots in Osprey's A1 Skyraider book, it looks pretty accurate. So good job, HobbyMaster, for nailing the color schemes in the antennas, as well as the UHF, VHF aerials here and here. I would have liked to see on the canopy right here some modeling of the Yankee seat extraction system. The way that works is it's not quite an ejection seat, but it's like 9/10 of an ejection seat, if that makes sense. Essentially what happened is originally bailouts were to be accomplished the World War II way, which is to slide the canopy back and then just jump out. But getting hit at low altitude in the Southeast Asian theater, the people figured out real quick that we probably needed something a little quicker to work than just jumping out over the side. So to ensure safe removal and extraction from a stricken Skyraider, they built in something called a Yankee extraction system. And what it does is it's a rocket that sits pretty much right there. It's like a white, essentially a white low-grade bottle rocket that sits there. And when the pilot hits the switch to activate it, the canopy is blown off like a traditional ejection seat. The canopy ejection pulls the rocket from its stowage position, generally about here, to the vertical, where it fires. Once the rocket fires, the seat is then pulled out of the airplane, at which point the pilot's attached parachute will come free, and then the pilot can deploy their parachute and land, hopefully, to a waiting Jolly Green Giant helicopter in a trip back to the base bar. So I would have liked to see some modeling of that. The U.S. Navy ones, I don't believe had those, at least not initially, but the U.S. Air Force ones definitely had that fitted by 1969, so it would have been nice to see that in this version, but I'm not going to worry too much about its lack of inclusion. The rest of it's done pretty well. It's just something to note for HobbyMaster, or to potentially include in future releases. So I would definitely love to see them include that. Would be also cool to see some of the other Skyraiders that have served. The French Air Force used them in Chad and Africa all the way up to the 1980s. So I would be really interested in to see them do a re-release of one of those. I think they did if my memory serves, on the HobbyMaster collector site, they did do a Chad French Air Force release in the past. Be nice to see that again in the future. So that's good to reflect on. And with that, we will get to what I think of it. And I think it's, even out of the box, completely clean. I think it's a good model to invest in. Just bear in mind that, like the Air Commander ones, these tend to trade for a pretty high premium once the model run has completed. So on the secondary market, unless you have a fortunate connection like I did when I got this, these tend to trade for pretty high prices. So as of this video, the U.S. Navy VA-176 Skyraider is still available at retail stores for about $120 US. So if you're watching this in close proximity to December 2022, please look those up and buy one, because they are really cool. And I think Skyraiders are one of those airplanes that don't get the credit they deserve. So if you're a fan of propeller airplanes, or a fan of World War II style equipment, or Korea War equipment, or Southeast Asian models, you definitely need one of these in your collection. Thank you for watching my video to this point. If you are a subscriber, I will also offer my thanks as well. Thank you for the support. And for those of you who are not subscribers, consider subscribing. This way you will be notified when I upload a new video. Just bear in mind that all of the models that you see here are of my personal collection. They're not given to me or offered on loan from a retailer or manufacturer. So the opinions and information I'm giving you is not influenced by any outside party. It is, however, influenced by how much tea I may have had that morning before I shot the video. So, bias is disclosed. If you want to be kept up to date on my latest videos, feel free to subscribe so you'll be in the know, I should say, and stay tuned for my next upload. Thank you again for watching. Check out my other videos on the channel, and you'll probably see something in my collection videos that you'll like, and we'll catch you in the next video.